We're at the Royal College of Physicians in London for the Connected TV World Summit Virtual Content Series, and I'm joined by Bisson, who's the Executive Director at Ampere Analysis, one of the world's leading analyst firms. So welcome to you, Guy.
Thank you.
Okay, well, we're going to talk about some of the massive disruptions in the media industry, but before we do that, let's just focus on coronavirus just for a moment. Not so much the health implications, but the potential economic impact. There are predictions that we could see a sort of a sharp stop like 2008 and 9. And I don't want you to predict what happens exactly in this scenario, but what happened in 08, 09 as a sort of base level kind of lesson?
Well, I think it impacts different sectors of the value chain differently. So what we saw in 08, 09, of course, was a fairly significant impact on advertising, for example. We did see also an impact on subscription television, but there's a slight delay in that. So that tends to have a lag of 1 to 2 years before that really impacts. If we go into severe global recession, I would absolutely expect to see similar impacts on those sectors. Of course, those sectors, television advertising, linear TV, pay TV, or traditional pay TV at least, also have structural challenges at the moment which could potentially accentuate that economic knock-on.
Yeah, I mean, I think your figures at the time were minus 8% for TV advertising. Does that sound about right? That was kind of like a major decline.
Yeah, I mean, we saw sort of large single-digit declines in advertising revenue for TV, absolutely. Online continues to grow, but that growth we would expect to slow as well if there is this global downturn. Obviously, there are winners also potentially from this. In-home entertainment formats, notably streaming platforms, potentially could see a boom time in terms of uptake and certainly consumption, at least in the short term as people go into self-imposed lockdown in the household.
Okay, well, let's hope it's not as bad as it could be. But if we get beyond the coronavirus then, I mean, there's, as you said, lots of big strategic structural issues to deal with as well. I mean, in terms of content, that's the kind of the really hot area right now and its implications for the winners and the losers in this market. I mean, how do you see things playing out? There's big investments, major investments. I mean, are they even sustainable, some of the money that SVODs are putting into content?
I think they are sustainable. I think as what we're in is, as you've said, is a period of intense disruption. So during periods of intense disruption, we see redistribution of spend and, of course, revenue. And what we're seeing is some of that revenue moving away from the traditional players. And so that money being spent by the SVODs is simply moved from one pot to the other. That's perhaps slightly underplaying it because we are, of course, in the middle of an unprecedented content boom, particularly around original production, and particularly around high-end, high-budget drama, for example. But Netflix's model, while challenged nominally for their negative free cash flow, which is driven by that massive spend with money going out on production that is then amortized over several years, it's simply a matter of catching up on the ARPU, or the value per customer. And the amount that they need to do that by is not as astronomical as you might expect. We did a model that suggested it was in the region of $1.60, $1.67 per customer per month increase in value in order to plug that free cash flow deficit. So depending on how you look at it, it is sustainable. What's interesting, though, is that it's self-perpetuating. I do think we are in a cycle now that is feeding itself, if you like. It's the classic snake eating its own tail, because the need for global rights is the big change. The industry has changed from one that is very geographically segmented and licensed, and the way that content is made and sold was very single territory, to one that is global, and that need for global rights has fed this cycle that is now very difficult to get out of, because as more and more original production comes in, that's competitively advantageous. Others jump on the bandwagon, more production, more shortage of facilities and talent, budgets go up, pressures go up, and you then look to see how you can continue that production. And one way to do that is through leveraging local resource. And so we're also seeing a boom in non-US global and regional production that of course then feeds back into that cycle.
Yes, well, we saw the Netflix announcements for the UK studios, and I mean, in terms of global and local, is the next big battle in local content itself, not necessarily using local resource, but actually putting content out there that appeals to the national markets? And are the SVODs going to pile in there and become a major danger to local broadcasters?
I think they already have. I mean, certainly Netflix has. More than half of Netflix's nearly 300 shows that they have in production are being made outside the US. So Netflix has already gone there. Amazon to a degree as well. And of course then we have the local pay TV operators who have jumped on the original production bandwagon. What's interesting in terms of the local broadcasters is that until a year or two ago, the SVODs were largely focused on drama and scripted content. That is changing very rapidly, and in fact growing very strongly is unscripted production from the SVOD players, and indeed acquisition. It's not all about production. That brings them perhaps even more into the territory of local broadcasters, who of course certainly in Saturday night primetime slots have relied heavily on sort of unscripted formats that have driven their schedules and the sort of water cooler television moments for those broadcasters. So I think absolutely there's a change in the entire dynamic of content, what is getting made, what is getting produced, where the investment is going, that will continue to impact the local players.
So what do they do about that then? So if you're the local broadcaster, you know this is coming, what can you do to make sure you keep the eyeballs on your show on Saturday night or during the week?
Well, there are a number of things, and in many ways, many of them are already doing it, particularly in Europe. So having a strong and compelling streaming service, augmented often with additional and exclusive content, and also the way that you schedule on that streaming service. So dropping box sets on first day of a drama airing is one way to bring audience to that streaming service. But I think they can do more, and again, we're beginning in Europe at least to see the beginnings of this, is broadcaster collaboration. Now, there are two aspects to that. One, of course, is that you're aggregating audience and therefore increasing your impact within the wider streaming market in a given region. The other is it gives you the opportunity to enter new business models. So a classic example, of course, is BritBox, which is a paid subscription service, ITV Hub Plus, and others that are taking traditionally free-to-air and commercial ad-supported broadcasters into a subscription business as an aside. But I think the real opportunity is to collaborate on free-to-air platforms and build scale in the free-to-air streaming space, because that really is the next battleground for SVOD as the market has got more and more crowded. Free-to-air or ad-supported or AVOD is going to be the big story of this year and the coming few years.
And does that also lead to repatriating your content? So BBC, ITV, obviously, they can bring content into BritBox, which may be in Netflix or Amazon today. But do you expect to see that?
Absolutely, as the big studios have done, as the big US studios have done with their direct consumer offers and beginning to pull content off third-party streaming services, I would expect the broadcasters to begin to do the same. It's always a balance because, of course, depending on how significant your licensing income is, how quickly you can do that. The BBC and ITV have clearly set up their commercial arms as studio businesses. So licensing, at least international licensing, I think, will continue to be important to them for some time to come. but pulling off a few tentpole shows exclusively into the streaming service definitely is going to be a next step in the evolution of those broadcaster-led and ad-supported platforms.
And will that do significant damage to the SVODs? If the big European broadcasters pulled their content, how much do the SVODs rely on that?
Well, in lieu of accurate viewing data, it's very hard to say. We've got some evidence from the US studio content. So of the 5 major studios who've announced fairly firm plans or have already gone direct, they account for about 20% of content on Netflix. So a fairly significant volume of Netflix's content is coming from those majors. We know from Nielsen data, for example, that Friends was one of the most viewed shows on Netflix, and that is one of the shows, of course, that is being pulled off. So potentially some of these big broadcaster shows that have had a life and a success on linear television will have a disproportionate impact on the streaming players. Of course, they're rapidly making up for any loss through their own production and through their acquisition strategies. But that's not as easy to do as it at first may seem, because many of these broadcaster shows are established hits with established fan bases. And that helps with another aspect that's important to streaming, and that is recognition and discovery of shows within that disaggregated non-linear space. And that's something that broadcaster-led brands can do quite well.
Yeah, I mean, does repatriation by broadcasters drive people like Netflix and Amazon harder into originals? Would that be their response to that?
I think it's inevitable, and that's part of the self-perpetuating cycle I was talking about. Once studios and broadcasters and others begin to pull back, it has 2 effects. One, it potentially increases the value of content from people who are continuing to license, so the large independents, for example. But 2, it definitely impacts how Netflix deals with the broadcasters and the licensing. And as they pull that off, absolutely, they have to move into making up for that. I mean, original production is significant and important to Netflix, but it's easy to forget that the majority of their content is still acquired in the open market. So nominally, the impact is actually greater on, for example, large independents, European film producers, and large independent distributors, perhaps like Endemol, Banijay, and others, and Fremantle, who are, at the moment at least, continuing to license to that international market.
And is it fair to assume that sports would not be something that comes to the rescue of local broadcasters? They can't afford the rights for that generally?
Yeah, that's another really big question, because we're seeing all sorts of moves around sport content as well. So at the top flight with the Premier League, we've obviously seen a slight pullback from the traditional gatekeepers, so Sky sharing some of those rights. The leagues themselves are all examining how they engage with an audience in streaming, whether they pull back or retain some rights, for example, for their own streaming services, whether they look to go direct completely themselves. And then we have 2 other issues. One is engaging the very young audience who are moving away from sport, partly because it's been exclusive on high-cost platforms for 20 years, and they've not been exposed to it to the degree that perhaps you and I were as children, when a lot of it was on BBC. And so re-engaging that young audience is another key issue for sports and sports leagues. And the third point is that the streaming technology, at least for very mass audience, simultaneous live viewing, is perhaps quite not where it needs to be in order for streaming players to move into that space in a big way. So for now, the broadcasters are in an interesting position. They potentially offer re-engagement with some of that audience that has begun to move away, and they potentially give an opportunity to build that audience in the free-to-air space. So I think the answer is, to a degree, it could come to the rescue But the issue you've highlighted around access to rights and the cost of those rights, of course, it remains the big barrier.
But you think there will be more rights sharing where it's split between pay and a bit more goes to free in future, and some of that could be broadcast?
I think some of that, absolutely. So I think there will be more sharing. Some of it could go to broadcast. But of course, you've got this looming additional disruptor, which is streaming and what the sports leagues themselves are intending to do with their rights around streaming and direct.
Okay. Well, let's talk about direct more widely. So direct to consumer. We've got Disney Plus coming soon to most of Europe. Very exciting launch. I mean, what do you think the impact of direct to consumer will be on the sort of media value chain as a whole, both sort of short and long term?
It has multiple impacts along the value chain. We're already seeing experimentation with windowing and how the traditional theatrical window plays into the value of content. And I believe we're beginning to see the start of perhaps the importance of that window for valuing content become less important. What I'm not saying is that theatrical disappears as a window or as a category within the value chain. I don't think that's going to happen. But I think that the way that particularly the big studios begin to funnel content into those direct platforms will impact the earlier windows within the value chain. So we'll see a lot more content going straight into those streaming platforms, which has been a Netflix strategy for some time. So that's going to have an impact. Where power sits in terms of production investment will also shift to a degree. So the studios that up until now have largely been making content for their own entities, of course, but also for others, increasingly we're seeing pullback there. So Disney, for example, of all these shows they currently have in production, only 10% of those are being made for non-Disney entities. So potentially we've got a bottleneck in production for everybody else as those studios begin to pull back licensed content, but also pull back production and funnel their own production into their own platforms. So it's actually a really significant change in the whole value chain, potentially impacting how and where people buy and get access to content. And by people, I mean the business people as well as the consumers.
Okay, well, let's look at the impact on pay TV then. So if you're a pay TV operator, you've been used to having, say, Disney as an exclusive. You know, you'd have to pay about £30 to sort of get access into the pay platform where you can get Disney. In future, you might only need £5 and it's available everywhere to everybody. I mean, they lose a key differentiator, don't they?
It's a really interesting question because nominally, for a pay TV platform, once we're through a period of very intense disruption, nominally nothing changes because, as we've seen, Sky has done a deal to bring Disney Plus onto Sky Q. So what we're talking about is pay TV operators who are aggregators of channels, potentially aggregating streaming services or streaming channels. So on the face of it, nothing changes for them in respect that they're doing deals with the new channels that happen to be streamed. But I think what has changed is the way that people think about the value proposition. And through this period of disruption where we've had disaggregation and the ability to buy into single services at a relatively low price point, although of course when you reaggregate that quickly adds up, I think the whole value proposition around pay TV is what's changing rather than the business relationship about aggregating what, at the end of the day, are channels. Now, having said that, the other fly in the ointment, if you like, is that complete disaggregation of content discovery, even within a single streaming platform. So it becomes much more difficult to find what you want to watch. And because we're going in and out of different interfaces all the time, Amazon is different from Netflix, is different from Disney, is different from Hulu. We do have a challenge that, again, potentially pay TV operators are sitting in a good position to solve. But of course, the problem they're facing is other new entrants who perhaps are not coming at it from the content strategy like Disney, NBC, Universal and Warner, but are coming at it from the tech strategy. So the likes of Apple, for example, who potentially jump straight in to that aggregation play and do a better job of solving it than the pay TV operators, and that, of course, is the threat.
Okay, well, let's talk about Apple a little bit later, but in terms of the pay TV operators and direct-to-consumer, will they still have exclusivity? I mean, at the moment, Disney are doing kind of, looks like country deals for distribution with big pay TV operators. I mean, will pay TV operators be able to sort of have something that's exclusive that the rest of us won't get if we're not pay TV subs?
That's hard to say at this stage. I think increasingly it will be difficult to get studio-created, exclusive drama and movies. But of course, the pay TV, or the larger ones at least, have moved themselves into original production, so they can continue to get exclusivity that way. As we saw in the channel, digital channel business in the early days, we may see for a period exclusive carriage of streaming services. So Disney, for a period, being exclusive on Sky, for example. So there's other ways to go at exclusivity. But I think increasingly it will definitely become difficult for the middlemen, who are the pay TV operators, to leverage what was previously one of their key advantages, which was exclusive content.
Okay. Is it a big opportunity for mobile providers or, triple play providers to use streaming as a kind of a free catch to get you into mobile and things like that? I think Verizon in the US, they've got Disney, they're going to offer Disney Plus, or they are, and right, is with a mobile subscription. So yes, is that a big opportunity for other service providers to kind of like as an acquisition tool or a customer churn reduction tool to kind of throw things in like that?
Yeah, I think it's potentially interesting. Long term, I don't think it's hugely impactful. It's good for both parties at the stage in the market that we're at, where the new streaming services are trying to build audience as quickly as possible. And at this stage, it's advantageous for them, and it's advantageous for the mobile providers. And it also fits well with the need for increasingly for them to provide access and bandwidth. So they marry together quite nicely, and I would expect that to continue to be a strategy for both parties in the near term, absolutely.
Okay, we'll come back to the user experience in a moment, but in terms of smaller pay TV operators, is there any difference to how they have to deal with direct-to-consumer? I mean, they've got less market clout, market strength. Do they become exposed, or can they just get onboarding deals? Will these direct-to-consumer streamers go and get on as many platforms as they can, as Netflix have done, for example?
I think they will, but what we've seen with Netflix, of course, is that they did focus very much on the very large platforms to do deals with. Our data suggests that, excluding China now, because Netflix is not in China, and if we exclude that massive base, Netflix has on-platform reach of 50% of global pay TV homes, which is fairly significant. So they've done a very good job of achieving reach in that way. The smaller operators have been less important in that strategy, but I don't think that necessarily means that they have less power in terms of negotiating those deals. As we move through the very big operators, it will become just as attractive to be on those smaller platforms.
Okay, and you expect people like Disney Plus and HBO Max to try and maximise their reach on pay TV platforms? I
think so. I think it's advantageous to them. They don't lose anything by doing it. It's upside for them. It's not stopping them selling direct, as we've seen. So I think they will continue to do those deals.
Okay, we started talking about how it might look on a pay TV platform or any aggregation platform, but do we lose linear channels? Certainly as we get, say, 3 or 4 big studio direct-to-consumer apps, do they then take away their linear channels and drive all the viewing into their apps, whether it's streamed live or on demand? But they kind of deep link you into an app and it becomes an IP stream. It's no longer kind of like classic linear broadcast guide anymore.
So I think it's important to mention at this juncture in the questioning that linear TV is still the biggest chunk of viewing across the world. I don't think there's a single country where linear is not the majority of viewing. So linear as a consumption experience remains important to the TV equation. I think rather than the studios scrapping their linear channels, what we begin to see is them bringing those linear channels into the wider streaming offer. So when you go into a streaming platform, you can engage with a non-linear experience or with a linear experience, and we're beginning to see that within the AVOD space, that streaming free channels are becoming part of the wider offer. So I think that will be the shift, rather than linear experiences or channels disappearing altogether. We just get them moving as others have into that streaming environment.
Okay, and you started to touch upon the sort of the future value add of the pay TV operator in terms of aggregation, bringing together these different services. And is it a given that pay TV operators have to be a super aggregator, and they have to be kind of like so intelligent at content discovery that there's a reason for you to go to them because they have a better understanding of what you want and they will surface it for you more easily than anybody else will do? Is that what is their key value add in future if they do lose some exclusivity?
I would argue that's in a way always been their key value add. At the end of the day, they are content aggregators. That content has traditionally been delivered by linear channels, and that's what they've traditionally aggregated. But I think absolutely, and I've been saying it for years, long before we'd even thought about direct consumer from the studios, their potential is to do that and do it well. Where the challenge comes is I'm not sure they moved quite quickly enough and seized that opportunity when it was really nascent. There was a period where Netflix and others were seen as the great threat and the great challenge, and not as a frenemy as they're seen as now. And perhaps they've missed some of that opportunity, and that's why others have come into the market. So Apple, I've mentioned, but device aggregators as well, like Roku, who are doing wonders in terms of their growth around the world.
Yeah. So Apple then, let's talk about them. They to me seem like the unknown. You seem to have a clear idea that they could become an aggregator. Is that their mission more than to become a studio like Netflix?
I think very much what we've seen, and it was clear to me when they announced, and they had that 3-hour, somewhat tedious press event announcing their plans. It was very clear that aggregation was central to that. So Apple TV Plus is really their premium channel play, the thin layer of icing on the cake that is the wider offer. That wider offer is about aggregating other streaming services. But what I found really interesting in the announcement was that they said they would also aggregate traditional pay TV so that you could subscribe to your cable provider or DirecTV satellite in the US through the Apple interface. So I think aggregation is, or making complex things work well and simply, is what Apple is good at. I think they understand that, and I think therefore that will be a core part of their strategy. To come back though to the studio point, I think everyone who's in certainly the direct space, the direct streaming space, is increasingly acting like a studio, just at different scales. So the Apple Studio Play will be much smaller than, say, the Netflix Studio Play or obviously the Disney or any of the other major studio plays. But I think it will increasingly have elements that make it look more and more like a studio.
Yeah, your figures from November, I think Apple, they had 45 hours of content.
Yeah.
Versus, for the same money, other services had 3,000 hours. With that, presumably they won't differentiate on content anyway. I know they're going to invest much harder. Do you expect a big push on content? And is the content just there to kind of catch our attention, or is the content half the point of it at least, with aggregation being the other half?
Well, the content, as I said, I think is the icing, and not to forget that Apple is selling devices. So Apple is one of the players that has another business which is in many ways, well, not in many ways, is more important to them than the content business. So Amazon is the other obvious example. So when we talk about Apple and certain other players within the market, we must remember the other business, and that other is quite a significant and scaled business that they are shoring up, protecting, boosting through their content plays. So those types of operation are never going to be as big a content player as the pure plays, the Disneys and the Netflixes. And that's why we see the difference. But I think it will remain an important part of the strategy, just not on the scale of the pure play content players.
Do you think Apple have got any kind of unique strengths, whether it's the user experience or the sort of the data knowledge, that they could do a better aggregation job than other people? I mean, could they produce something that's really quite new and exciting that we haven't seen already?
Potentially, yes. And I do think, as I said, that their strength is making complex things work incredibly simply. The iPod, for example, going back many years now, was an incredible simple interface for music, with basically a button and a spin wheel, and that was it to navigate your music experience. We forget how revolutionary that was at the time in terms of content, that content being music, but in terms of content discovery. And I think if they can crack that, that is the next frontier, the next unsolved problem, because as people take more and more streaming services, that problem just gets bigger and bigger. It doesn't go away.
Okay. And you mentioned a moment ago that pay TV operators Apple's plan was to have pay TV on board as a part of their aggregation. I mean, if the pay TV operator gives up their own kind of user experience, or at least gives up primacy of the user experience and allows Apple to come on top of that, I mean, is that a dangerous strategy to allow? Or?
Again, it comes back to the question of when do you make your move? Is it a dangerous strategy? I think the question maybe alternatively would be, is it a dangerous strategy to not do that? And I suspect the answer to that is yes, that would be a dangerous strategy. So they're almost at a point where their hand is forced. So, and I think we will see them increasingly become part of a wider aggregation offer.
Okay, well, final question, just coming back to direct-to-consumer and its impact. Out of if the direct-to-consumer studios repatriate their content from anybody, so they're bringing some of it back off pay TV or free-to-air and SVOD as well, who's likely to be hurt the most? Do you think that actually helps pay TV, or does it weaken SVOD, global SVODs, more than it does pay TV ultimately?
I don't think it weakens them more. I think anyway it will have an equal impact across the value chain that is reliant on acquired content, and across the value chain that is reliant up till now on exclusivity. So I don't think there's a huge difference in the impact. The difference will come in how prepared each of those platforms is and how diversified they are into their own original production. But as you mentioned earlier, pay TV does have that other battering ram that is sport, at least for the time being, that will continue to be an important driver for pay TV, because among the audience for which sport is important, it ascends to the be-all and end-all. It is the most important thing. And while it's only about 40% of people who fall into that category, for those 40%, it's a significant driver. Again, the next question will be how quickly will that area be disrupted? And that's the next big challenge, of course.
Okay, well, I think we're going to be talking about this stuff for a few more years yet. So thank you very much, Guy, for giving us your insights. It's fabulous as ever, and thank you.
Thank you.